Okay, so when to use werden and when to use sein when making a passive in German? A very crucial question we're going to be looking at now. As we know, there are two ways of making a passive in German. One uses werden as an auxiliary verb and one uses sein. And it's important to know when to use what auxiliary. So just to recap, there are two versions of passive in German. One uses a form of werden as an auxiliary verb and a past participle. This form of the passive is often referred to as the process passive or the werden passive. The second form of the passive in German is the so-called statal passive or sein passive, and as the name suggests, it uses a form of sein as an auxiliary verb and a past participle of the main verb to go with it. It's important to point out at this stage that in percentage terms, the werden passive is by far the most frequent form in German. So the sein passive, the statal passive, even though it looks very similar to the passive in English, is in fact not particularly common in German, and it is very important not to get the sein and the werden passive confused. Now let's look at some examples, and let's first of all look at an example of the sein or the statal passive. We've got a picture here of a little wooden house, and we could probably safely say about this house, das Haus ist aus Holz gebaut. The house is built of wood. We can see it in front of us. We can see a finished product, and we can see it's made of wood very clearly. And that's exactly what the sein or statal passive is used for in German. It's used to refer to a state or a result. Now if we look at this picture of a house, here we can clearly see that there is no result yet, and that our house is still very much in a process of being built. So what we need here is a process passive or a werden passive. So we would probably say in German, das Haus wird aus Holz gebaut. The house is built of wood, in the sense of the house is being built of wood. So it's in a process of being built, and that's an example for a werden passive used to refer to a process or an action. Now the distinction between the werden and the sein passive does not exist in English. So English doesn't differentiate between a statal and a process version of the passive. English uses to be as an auxiliary each time. However, you might find it helpful when you're making German passives to remember that the progressive form of the passive in English, i.e. the passive in English that uses being, is always equivalent to a process or a werden passive in German. So if you could use being in English, you have to use werden in German. The passive in German, werden or sein, we use werden for processes or actions, we use sein for finished results and states.